At 5:42 that morning, I found 2 excavators parked on my ranch road, 3 contractor trucks behind them, and my HOA president standing there with a $6 million pipeline easement printed with my land description on it. There was just one problem. She didn't own a single inch of it. And when I looked past those machines, I saw an excavator blade lined up 12 feet from the wildflower meadow where my wife's ashes were buried. That was when I called my lawyer and said, "Bring the injunction," because somebody was about to learn the hard way that you do not steal a man's land while he's still standing on it. Vivian Hartwell smiled like she'd already won, calm, polished, arrogant. The kind of smile people wear when they think the fight is over before it starts. The Texas morning was cool, dry cedar hanging in the air, sunlight just breaking over the ridge and turning the grass gold. My cattle stood down by the lower fence line, watching those strangers the same way I was. Nobody belongs on ranch land at dawn unless they have permission, and nobody there had mine. Vivian handed me the paperwork in a leather folder. County stamps, legal descriptions, survey references. At first glance, it looked airtight. That's how fraud works. It only has to look real long enough for the bulldozers to move. I read through it, page by page, until I found what I knew I'd find: the lie. The parcel number matched my ranch, but the chain of title skipped a survey transfer. One missing link. That was enough. Without it, there was no legal bridge between the old county utility corridor and my private road. In plain English, they were standing on land they had no right to touch. But I didn't tell Vivian that yet. Instead, I looked at the excavator pointed toward the meadow. Marin's meadow. 12 feet away. That meadow wasn't just another patch of ground. It was where my wife had planted bluebonnets by hand while chemo drained the life out of her. It was where I scattered her ashes after she died. Seeing steel teeth aimed at that soil didn't feel like business. It felt like desecration. Vivian mistook my silence for surrender. "This route benefits everyone," she said. "Silver Glass Ridge approved the easement unanimously." I looked up at her and said, "Funny. You can't approve what you don't own." Her smile slipped for half a second. That was enough for me. Behind her, the crew started setting orange survey flags. A foreman asked if they should begin. Vivian nodded. An excavator rumbled to life, diesel shaking through the ground under my boots. And if you've spent nearly 3 decades in pipeline integrity like I have, you know exactly what that sound means. Once steel touches dirt, stopping a project gets 10 times harder. That's why they always rush the first cut. It makes everything feel inevitable. My phone buzzed. "Clara," I answered fast. "They're moving," I said. "You confirm it?" she asked. "Yes. Broken survey chain." A beat of silence. Then she said, "Good. Hold them." That was it. No panic, no speech, just hold them. I slid the phone back into my pocket while the first orange flag went into the ground beside the creek. My creek, my road, my land. And standing there watching strangers mark a path through my ranch, I realized this was no longer just about a pipeline, because people don't fake land records unless there's something bigger buried underneath. And whatever Vivian Hartwell was building, it was worth enough for her to bet everything on me backing down. She was wrong. My family bought that ranch in 1937, 612 acres of Texas limestone, cedar breaks, live oak, and spring-fed water. My grandfather raised cattle there. My father did too. Then me. I was born in the house on the ridge above the creek bend. Learned to ride before I could read, learned fences, flood lines, crossing stones, pasture patterns. By 12, I knew every inch of that ranch. Some men inherit money. I inherited responsibility. Later, I left to work in pipeline integrity, pressure systems, corrosion, leak analysis, environmental safety. I spent 28 years watching what happens when men cut corners and call it progress. I saw creeks poisoned, ranches ruined, and corporations apologize only after the damage was permanent. That's why Vivian picked the wrong man, because I knew exactly what a line on a map could really cost. I came back to the ranch because of Marin. I met her at a county fair when she was arguing with an old ranch wife over whether pecans belonged in peach cobbler. She laughed with her whole body like joy moved through her. She wasn't raised on land like this. San Antonio girl, city-born, but she loved that ranch faster than I ever did, especially the creek. There was a meadow near the lower bend where wildflowers used to grow before drought and cattle wore it thin. Most people saw dead grass. Marin saw possibility. Then she got sick. Stage 4 cancer changes the sound of a house, makes everything quieter. Hospitals, scans, chemo, long drives, longer nights. But every time she had the strength, she'd take gloves and seed and walk down to that meadow. Blue bonnets, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans. She planted them by hand. Sometimes I'd sit on the cedar bench nearby and watch her, weak from treatment, hands shaking, still working that soil. I'd tell her to rest. She'd smile and say, "Flowers don't wait for perfect weather, Nolan." The spring before she died, that whole meadow bloomed blue and red and gold. She stood there crying, holding my hand. A few months later, she was gone. The last real promise I made her was on that same bench. She leaned against me and whispered, "Don't let them turn this place into concrete." I told her I wouldn't. So when I saw that excavator blade 12 feet from the ground where her ashes lay, this stopped being a property dispute. It became a promise under threat. The first time Vivian Hartwell came to my ranch, she brought cookies. That should have warned me. People don't drive 10 miles into ranch country carrying warm peach cookies unless they want something. She smiled, complimented the property, then got to the point. Silverglass Ridge was expanding. New homes, new infrastructure, future opportunity. She wanted an easement across the lower section of my ranch. She offered $400,000 like she was buying an old tractor. I told her no. 2 weeks later, she came back with maps and $900,000, straight through the creek, straight through the meadow. Still no. The third time, she brought a lawyer and raised it to $1.6 million. That was when the soft threats started. "You can't stop growth," she said. I stood up from my kitchen table and told her, "Growth ain't your word for theft." A few days later, I found survey stakes on my land. 23 of them, cut in a clean line across my south pasture toward Marin's meadow. I pulled them out one by one. When I snapped the last one in half, a white survey truck parked on the ridge just watched me, then turned around and left. That was when I understood Vivian had never come to negotiate. She came to measure how hard I'd be to remove. So I started watching. Her name kept showing up in county meetings, zoning sessions, utility board discussions, and everywhere I turned, I heard a different version of the same sales pitch. Homeowners were told this project would lower dues. Others were promised better water pressure, better drought protection, better fire response. Different stories, same project. Truth stays consistent. Sales pitches change depending on who they're aimed at. So I went to a Silverglass Ridge board meeting and sat in the back. Vivian stood at the front like she was running for office, smiling under projector lights while maps and charts glowed behind her. Then I saw it. A red line crossing my ranch, my creek, my meadow. She called it a proposed utility corridor for long-term regional sustainability. But in the corner of that slide was a line that mattered. Pending final corridor clearance. Pending. If clearance was still pending, why had survey stakes already been planted on my land? Why had money already been offered? Why were routes already engineered in detail? Because this wasn't planning. It was advancement. Permission was just expected to catch up later. The next morning I called Wes Morgan, an old friend and retired title examiner. 2 days later he called me back and said the words that changed the whole fight. "There's already a preliminary easement contract filed with the pipeline company." "How much?" I asked. $6 million. That told me everything. Vivian hadn't been trying to convince me. She had already sold access to land she didn't own and was trying to force reality to catch up to the lie. So Clara and I went to the county records office. She'd been my attorney for 12 years, Land rights, water disputes, access fights. She was the kind of lawyer who hated shortcuts on principle. We spread Vivian's paperwork across an old oak table and started pulling records, plats, deeds, road filings, utility easements, historic transfers. By noon, the table looked like a storm hit it. And then Clara found it. The ranch road had never been sold, never transferred, never partially granted. Not once. It had been private since 1937. Still mine. That should have killed the whole easement by itself. But it got worse. On a 1987 survey map, the corner markers had been shifted 27 feet. That may not sound like much, but on land, 27 feet can move an entire corridor. We pulled the original survey book. The real markers didn't match the one used in Vivian's easement packet. That wasn't a clerical error. That was replacement. Then we checked silver glass ridge board approvals. 3 votes authorizing utility partnerships. Clean on the surface, until we noticed the DA. By late afternoon, we had rebuilt the real title chain from my grandfather's deed forward. Clean, unbroken, no corridor, no HOA authority, no rights, which meant the $6 million easement was built on false ownership, fraud at best, criminal conspiracy at worst. Clara's plan was simple. Warn them first. I hated it. Warnings give people time to hide things. But Clara was right. If we warned them and they kept moving, then it became intent. And intent changes everything. A few days later, that intent found me. I got a call from Linda Barrett, the HOA treasurer. We met behind Miller's feed store before sunrise. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She handed me a flash drive and said, "I thought this was about lowering dues." Inside were board emails, payment records, contractor agreements, meeting transcripts. And buried in that pile was the truth. Vivian had been collecting off-book money, personal kickbacks, consulting transfers, permit expedite fees, pressure emails. One of them said, "Nolan's old. He'll fold if we keep pressure on him." That one made me laugh. Then Clara opened a folder labeled Phase 2. It wasn't for the pipeline. It was for what came after. Cooling systems, power infrastructure, massive water demand projections, a data center. That was the real project. The pipeline was just the doorway, and the planned draw hit the recharge line beneath my ranch, the same aquifer feeding cattle water, private wells, and part of the lower county system. If they built that system, half the county would be fighting over water inside 10 years. That changed everything. Before, this had been my land, my wife, my promise. Now it was everybody's water. And once Clara saw that, we knew why Vivian had pushed so hard. She wasn't just stealing a corridor. She was trying to secure the first cut before anyone understood the scale of what came next. 3 nights later, the sabotage started. First, my south pasture fence was clipped in 3 places. Clean cuts, deliberate. 20 head broke through. I recovered 19. The 20th I found dead on the highway. Then the creek was hit. Diesel drums dumped upstream, oil spreading over the water that crossed my recharge zone. I collected samples, documented everything, and called State Environmental. The 3rd strike came at 2:11 in the morning, smoke through the bedroom window, my south barn on fire. I fought it until the volunteers arrived. We saved part of it, but not all. Later, in the wet ash behind the wall, I found a burned glove with a pipeline subcontractor logo stitched on the wrist. Proof. Not enough for an arrest yet, but enough for me to understand the message. They were escalating. That night I stood in my hallway looking at my father's old Remington over the fireplace. For one long moment I thought about solving it the old way. Then I heard Marin in memory. "Don't let anger bury you here too." So I hung the gun back on the wall, checked my camera feeds, and called Clara. "Good," she said when I told her. I frowned. "Good?" "If they're panicking," she said, "it means we're close." By morning we had assembled everything. My full title chain, the altered plat, fake approvals, kickback ledger, environmental risk, Phase 2 data center plans. all of it. Clara sent cease and desist notices to the HOA, the pipeline company, the county, and state environmental. That afternoon, the pipeline company's attorney replied, "Construction remains on schedule." That was the moment they trapped themselves. They had been warned in writing, and they chose to proceed anyway. That night, Linda called again. "They're moving at sunrise," she whispered. "Vivian said once the line is cut, nobody can stop it." Clara grabbed the binder and said, "We filed tonight." She woke a judge for an emergency restraining order while I sat on the porch with cold coffee, the barn still smelling like smoke, waiting for daylight. At 5:12, she texted me. Signed. On my way. Hold them. At 5:38, I saw headlights. At 5:42, they were on my road. Excavators, pipe trailers, fuel tanks, welding crew. Vivian in a cream blazer with that same leather folder and that same smile. She walked toward me like she was cutting a ribbon. "Looks like you had all night to think," she said. I stood at the cattle guard and didn't move. "Still no?" she asked. Behind her, an excavator roared awake. Hydraulics hissed. The bucket lifted, 12 feet from Marin's meadow. "You can't stop progress," Vivian said. I looked at her and said, "No, but I can stop theft." She gave the foreman a nod. The bucket lowered toward the earth. Then came the headlights. Fast. 3 trucks first, then more behind them. Clara's truck. State Environmental.